Welcome to a new edition of Are You Live? Today we're joined by Daniel McCarthy, who is just very recently on Unregistered, who is the smartest conservative I know. And I learned a whole lot from him on that episode, and I know a lot of listeners did too, and viewers. And it's great to have you back. Thanks for joining us, Daniel.
Well, thanks for having me.
All the way from Alexandria, Virginia, the belly of the beast. What is it like to live in Washington, D.C. with someone with your worldview in politics?
Well, I enjoy it because it's a target-rich environment. There's always something here to keep me riled up and sort of focused on, keeping up the good fight.
I would imagine. I mean, I'm allergic to that city. I mean, I think almost literally the last time I was there, I got so sick I could barely walk, but it was completely psychosomatic. And there's something about the culture of that city that I find to be just it's like a virus inside of me trying to kill me. I don't know. I mean, don't you find that like I find it to be like just it's bureaucratic in every way, even in its architecture, even in the way that many people live. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, as you get to know the city, you find that it's not entirely like that, but it's certainly the easy first impression you get. And you've got different kinds of bureaucracy sort of embodied in DC itself, and then across the river with all the contractors in Arlington, Virginia, for example.
Yeah.
And that's oppressive in a whole, sort of category of its own. And you've got a lot of people who combine, sort of some of the worst stereotypes of yuppies with the worst stereotypes of political people. And so there's a lot of people here who are kind of very ambitious and on the move, but it's not in a kind of entrepreneurial way. It's in a way that's sort of, just depends upon them claiming to have a, sort of greater insight into truth and humanity than anyone else has.
Yeah, and then it's just chock full of lawyers too. Just lawyers everywhere, which is no good for anybody. Well, so we talked on the podcast quite a lot about Edmund Burke, and quite a lot about Russell Kirk as well. But Edmund Burke, I didn't mention this, but I first read Burke in 1996 when I was teaching the Great Books course at Columbia. And I remember, and at that time, I was a socialist. I was a left-wing academic socialist. And I thought, I like the feeling. And that's a really important word here, right? I like the feeling of this. And I have ever since I read Burke in 1996, and I've gone through all sorts of political transformations of my own, I have always had a good feeling about Burkean conservatism. Whenever I come across a Burkean conservative, I just like it. I like the feeling of it. I like the idea that I know that I imposed the word on it, but of organic growth, organic change over time, and also the respect, maybe even love for diversity, human diversity, the rejection or at least skepticism toward enlightenment, rationality, that we can find truth through science, that science becomes this sort of new god, that they rejected all that. They rejected sort of this, as I mentioned on the podcast, this universal sort of homogenizing force that came out of Rousseau and the French Revolution and gave us the 20th century and 21st century left, right? That kind of, so there's, and also, I mean, well, yeah, I mean, there's okay. And here maybe is the bottom of it. And this is something I wanted to follow up with you on from the podcast. It is the valuing of aesthetics that you said, and I did not know this until we talked, that you said is at the center of Burke's thought. Now, it's funny, I haven't read Burke enough to know that, but if you're right, I don't think there's another political philosopher, modern political philosopher, who does value or puts aesthetics as a value at the center. Does that make sense? Or does that comport with what
No,
you?
that makes sense. Yeah. Although, in saying Burke is early on in the philosophical tradition of discussing aesthetics. So, he's before Kant, he's before Hegel, he's before someone like Benedetto Croce. So his thoughts on aesthetics are sort of growing out of his familiarity with classical literature in part, and with the sort of developing views that you find also reflected in people like Adam Smith and David Hume, where they're very skeptical of what used to be, the sort of scholastic, Thomistic, sort of post-Aristotelian, quasi-Aristotelian tradition, and they're trying to find a new way to understand human nature. And Burke is saying that actually feeling is fundamental to human nature, more so perhaps than reason is.
Mm. Yeah, and so this raises all sorts of funny questions about what Burkean conservatism is then, even for me. So, you guys at the American Conservative reviewed Renegade History of the United States, and it was about a 90% positive review. And I thought that you guys had been dropped on your heads or something. You didn't know what being a conservative was. Like, why would you say something nice about my book? Because my book is about nothing but degenerates, right? um, so it's about prostitutes, drunks, sybarites of all kinds.
Yeah, but all of that is part of any traditional society, right? I mean,
There it
it
is.
has a place. It's just that the place is not in the public square, perhaps. So.
Yeah, there it is. I mean, I guess now I understand why you wrote a favorable review of my book.
Well, I think one of the key things about this classical conservatism,
Yeah.
it's the title of a book by the name of by a philosopher named Anthony Quinton. The title of his book, which I think is a very good summary of classical conservatism, is it's The Politics of Imperfection.
Hmm. Meaning?
Well, meaning that whereas an egalitarian, perhaps Marxist or leftist
Yeah.
impulse, or a libertarian impulse thinks that there is a maximum of liberty or a maximum of equality, there's some sort of abstract principle that can be brought to completion within human life and human politics.
Mm-hmm.
Conservatism says actually you're always going to be dealing with elements that don't fit into any kind of smooth ideological framework. And so you just have to kind of figure out how to have a living that will accommodate things in a sort of peaceful and effective and prosperous way, and that will maintain, a general sense of happiness for people, as opposed to, a kind of breakdown of society. And that's what a constitution and that's what a polity is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a shared framework for finding happiness. That doesn't mean necessarily, again, looking back in the kind of Thomistic way that some of our Catholic intellectuals do towards a singular common good, but it does mean that there's at least enough harmony among the aggregate, different goods that you can keep the thing together.
Yeah, it's anti-perfectionism also, right? This
Right.
is okay. This is also illuminating it more for me. So here's how I used to teach Rousseau and Burke. I would take a Sharpie, not a Sharpie, dry, what are they called? Whatever. On
Dry
the right,
erase bar, yeah.
on the whiteboard. Anyway, I would draw like big looping but different heights, undulating line across the board, right? So different heights here. And I would say, this is human beings. And you see, they're all different. Each little like lump is different, shorter, higher, fatter, thinner, whatever. That's tradition. That's where they ended up from, from tradition, right? What Rousseau does, and the Jacobins and all of his lineage come along, they just take an eraser and they just erase the whole top of all of them and make everybody the same height, basically everybody the same, right? And it's this, as I said in the podcast, it's this universalizing, homogenizing, leveling force that, well, we found out has to come through violence. I mean, if they get really, really, really lucky at some point in world history, they might not need to use violence to homogenize the entire population of the planet. But so far, it's always come with a lot of violence. But this idea that conservatism is, what did you call it? It's the politics of imperfection.
Right.
Wow. So that feels much better to me. That feels much more comfortable than having to be perfect. Right.
It is, but I mean, you can see that the charge that progressives level against conservatives is that they are insufficiently incensed by or agitated by injustices that may be old and established. And, I mean, Burke makes, a great point of not simply accepting whatever exists as therefore being good. He says that, a nation without the means of change is without the means of its conservation or preservation.
Mm-hmm.
But this is always something where conservatives can be accused of erring on the side of things that already exist and tolerating evils that already exist, as opposed to trying to reform them, having a sufficiently ambitious program to try to improve humanity or to make things better.
Yeah. So, right. You guys get rightly not accused, but described as, I suppose, not necessarily defending monarchies, but defending what? The defending elements of monarchies or something, right? Or just what is it? Or is it they're defending monarchies from universalizing, leveling, abstract
Yeah,
violence? Is that
it's
it?
defending the constitution, of a state as it has, developed and evolved over its history.
Okay.
And so if you have a monarchy, the conservative would tend to say, you know what, maybe that monarchy started out in conquest, maybe that monarchy started out in just pure exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
But chances are, after a couple of hundred years, there's been a certain kind of growing together and a softening of the originally purely exploitive process. And you should trust those processes of sort of gentle historical reform rather than trying to say, you know what, here's a blueprint for a phenomenally more just society. We should scrap everything we have right now and try to implement something that we've designed, which is much, sort of much better in um, our hopes at least.
What did Russell Kirk have to say about the Civil War?
Kirk had kind of a divided view about it. He sometimes said nice things about Lincoln. He, had certain sympathies with not so much the Southern cause in the Civil War, secessionism or any of that, but rather with the idea that the post-Civil War South generated, these Southern agrarians, these thinkers and poets who didn't like industrial society. So he liked the critique of the industrial North that came out of the South, without being, putting himself, in the position of supporting the politics or the slavery and other horrors of
Mm-hmm.
the South. So, and there's a tension there, obviously, and then there's a question of what is the connection between that sort of agrarian critique, that sort of the fugitive poets, and then John Crow Ransom and people like that.
Mm-hmm.
What's the connection between them and the rather bloody soil out of which their tradition
Yeah,
comes?
pause there for a second. So that you reminded me of the Southern agrarians, who I haven't read about since I was in graduate school back in the 19th century. So tell it, it's a fascinating movement, intellectual movement. Can you just give a summary of who the Southern agrarians were and what they stood for?
Yeah, they were a number of poets and literary thinkers, novelists who had political views, but the political views were highly sort of sentimental. They were very similar, actually. If some of the students here are familiar with distributism, which was this idea that G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc came up with in Britain, the Southern agrarians in the United States in the 1930s, they sympathized with British distributism, which is basically this idea that what the ideal form for society is, the kind of Jeffersonian ideal of the yeoman planter, and that industry is bad for a variety of reasons. In some ways, I mean, in the past, you and I talked about connections between conservatism and Marxism. Well, just as Marxism sees a certain denaturing and dehumanizing aspect to industrialism, the Southern agrarians saw that as well. And so the approach to politics and to land ownership and things like that that the Southern agrarians wanted to take was one that would more widely distribute, the means of, farming or having, kind of small businesses. So it was that sort of, agrarian shading into small town idealism.
Mm.
And again, it had a British parallel among these Catholic thinkers, Chesterton and Belloc. And you still find actually, a lot of interest and sympathy in these thinkers among, there's a website called Front Porch Republic, for example, where you find, these kinds of thoughts still expressed. So there's that very romantic sort of version of conservatism embedded with all of that. It is, of course, a little bit not just romantic, but reactionary as well. It kind of wants
Mhm.
to not just conserve something, but to actually posit a vision from the past, which may or may not have ever existed, and
Mhm.
kind of use it as a critique of the present in a
Mhm.
way that starts to raise some practical problems. So, what would it mean in practice to have, distributism or agrarianism? There are different conservative attitudes towards that question. One of them says, "Hey, this is a lovely vision. It's not meant to be a practical reality." And others would say, people might actually try to implement this, and then that would be such a difficult thing to do. It would wind up not being conservative at all.
Wow. Okay. So we're getting back into my old graduate studies. I love this. This is so exciting. So there's all sorts of fascinating connections that will surprise a lot of people that you are kind of talking around there. Um, so the Southern agrarian tradition, which is Jeffersonian, uh, this idea, which you described perfectly, it is the idea is that, people living on the land, from the land, are going to be more virtuous than those living in big cities who work in factories. So it is essentially an anti-capitalist critique, right? And an anti-modern critique as well. Um, these guys are anti-capitalists, right? But they're also sympathetic to the Old South. Now, where did they get that from? They got that from, in particular, this intellectual in the Old South, the slave South, George Fitzhugh, who is this very important intellectual who was a defender of slavery. He was the leading pro-slavery intellectual in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s. And George Fitzhugh basically used a Marxist analysis of the North to favorably compare the South to the North. He said, what happens in the North is that human beings are reduced to wage slaves, to chattel, who have to go from factory to factory, these horrible, inhumane conditions. They're forced by the necessity to live, for survival, to work for wages in places they would never work. Whereas we down here, we take care of our people. This is one big family. And that is not bullshit, by the way, entirely. I mean, if you've ever done any serious study of the slave South, you know that both many slaves and many masters, not all, but many on both sides, did believe that there was a family in those plantations, that between the slaves and their masters. But regardless, the critique of the North of capitalism, anti-capitalist critique that looked a lot like Marxism, had a place very firmly in the Old South. And then the Southern agrarians took that forward. And now I'm thinking, I'll make another connection. I'm sure you know about this guy, Eugene Genovese. It just occurred to me, right? It just occurred to me, he pulls all this together. Eugene Genovese, for me, is still the greatest historian of slavery and of the Old South. And he's considered by many professional historians that way too. He had this remarkable evolution in his own life. Genovese is a fascinating intellectual. Everybody should look up Eugene Genovese. Thank you, Landry, for putting the Wikipedia. He started out as a Marxist, and not just a Marxist. I think he was a variety of Marxists. He was a Maoist for a while. I think he might have been a Trotskyist, a Stalinist, but then toward, I guess, late middle age, he moved to conservative. He became a Christian conservative, and he basically had George Fitzhugh's critique, which was that the North was full of wage slaves and the South was a place where community was valued. The North was a place where everybody was atomized, made into little individual automatons working in factories, and the South was made up of families and familial ethics. Anyway, that was a huge, long discourse on the connections between these things. But the classical conservatism, Burkeanism, right, runs through all of it, doesn't it?
Well, but I should bring up a few points. So first of all, I mean, yes, George Fitzhugh, he's crazy. He's someone who you should read because he says things that you would never expect anyone, to say.
Yeah.
So Fitzhugh, in a weird way, tries to, in some places, deracialize slavery. He says that slavery is such a good thing that, in fact, it should be universal.
Right.
Everyone, white people included, should be subjected to slavery because this is such a. So Fitzhugh he's in a category of his own. As now, you're right. He's someone whose arguments, have a long legacy. Anyway, I just mentioned in case anyone is thinking that, when they hear about Fitzhugh, that they instantly have an image of, what he might be arguing or where he's coming from. He's actually far crazier than anyone could possibly imagine, which again makes him, and as you say, he was very influential in his time. He was very provocative. Yeah. So there's a lost piece of history there that people would find, I think, much weirder and stranger than they might have expected. Now, I should say something about the relationship of conservatism to industrialism, commerce, cities, and so forth.
Thank you.
Because this agrarian critique, which Russell Kirk picks up, in the 1940s and 1950s, it's not present in Edmund Burke himself. Now, of course, this is partly because Burke is before the heyday of the Industrial Revolution. It's still kind of just getting going. But in Burke, you actually do find a great appreciation of commerce. Burke is very much parallel to the thinking of someone like Adam Smith in economic thought. He also has a great many parallels with David Hume, and they were friends. So you have, and then within America, in the first decade of the Republic, you have basically the Federalist Party is in many respects the conservative party, small c, in the United States. Now it's, oversimplifying to say that the Federalists are simply small c conservatives. But they are the party that is very anti-Jacobin, very anti-French Revolution. They have a lot of parallels to the newly created Conservative Party in the UK, which comes about in 1834. So the Federalists are, in many respects, a small c conservative party. And of course, they're also the party of Hamilton. They're also the party of, a sort of prototype industrial policy. And you see that actually in American history and politics, throughout the next century and beyond, this is something that there's you can say that there's a strain of conservatism that continues to be pro-industrial and pro-developmental. So you see it perhaps with the American Whigs, you see it with Abraham Lincoln and the early Republican Party. So there is a tension in conservatism, which isn't there in Burke because he was early, but that later on becomes a question of capitalism is changing things. Does this mean you get on top of it and you have a plan for development? Or does it mean that you try to resist it and throw it back? It's maybe even a division between conservatism on the one hand and maybe a reactionary sentiment on the other. There is this complication in the tradition.
Yeah, I want to get back to this, but we have a couple of questions here. So Carlos, go ahead.
Hold on. Hey, what's up? Hey, Daniel, which state do you think will first secede successfully from the Union?
My friend Frank Buckley, who's a law professor at George Mason University, he thinks a progressive state will secede first. Maybe California.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, anything is possible, I suppose. I actually think one of the principles of conservatism is anti-secessionism. But
really?
Yeah, but there's a lot of people who think that localism should be taken all the way to sort of secession and so forth. No, I mean, as we talked about actually in the podcast, Edmund Burke, some people call him an anti-imperialist. I think there's a lot of truth to that. But Burke was not actually of the view that it was better or ideal for America or for Ireland or even for India to split off from the British Empire or a relationship with England. He actually thought that maintaining a relationship but doing it on a more sort of even and level basis was the way to go. And I think with a conservatism in general, there's this reluctance to have these kind of revolutionary fragmentations of a political order.
So Burke would see secession as a revolutionary fragmentation rather than as a good thing?
I think he certainly would, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I like him less now. That's too bad. Carlos, which state do you think is going to secede next or first? Next.
Texas for sure.
Well, of course, because you're in Texas. But
yeah, and then if we're lucky enough, then that will break up enough, and then counties, and then we'll just be individuals, right?
Well, that's what we're hoping for. But I don't know. I don't know if Texas is going to be first. You're too split up. Too many different constituencies down there, don't you think?
Yeah, but time will tell. I think things are going in the right direction.
All right. Yeah, I hope so. All right. Good question, though. I like that one. All right.
You better not let any MSNBC viewers see this, or they'll think that we have the Russians, supporting.
We've already been reported, Daniel. It's long. It's way too late for that. Yeah, we're already in the files. Sarima, where are you? Come on up, Sarima.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Very short one. I think it has to do with secession also. Brexit, yay or nay, and why?
Oh, good one. Great one.
Yeah. Yay, because, it's preserving the existing constitution and sovereignty of the United Kingdom as opposed to being something that is, already integrated and then is then being broken up. So conservatism tends to, favor the existing order, which means, breaking up that order is bad, but also turning that order into something much larger is also bad. And you see this with some of the tendencies towards, and this again, I think you see a balance in Burke, but it's one reason why there is an anti-imperialist side to him. So the idea of constantly growing the polity is problematic, just as the idea of breaking it up is.
Wait a second. Hold on now. The European Union is what, 20 years old-ish, right? How old is the youngest state? I mean, a few decades, right?
Yeah, about 50 years old, yeah.
About 50? So wait, why is secession in one good and the other bad?
Well, let me tell you about my friend Bill Kaufman.
You better bring in a friend now.
No, a friend of mine who was very pro-secession, actually, a writer up in upstate New York.
Oh, Bill Kaufman. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
But he would certainly say, oh, yeah, Hawaii, Alaska, those aren't real states. Those aren't real America.
That's a cop-out.
No, he's in favor of secession, at other levels as well.
Okay.
But he would probably start by saying, yeah, I mean, Hawaii is a kingdom of its own, and Alaska is, who knows what it is? I mean, but it could certainly be, it's large enough to be its own
But I'm asking,
designation.
but I'm asking you. I don't get it. What's your standard is confusing me. Like, what you're right? Which at what point does it become inorganic to secede? And at what point does secession? At what year of integration, right? Does it become, what'd you call it? Fragmentation?
Right.
To secede? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
so,
no, but I mean, obviously there's not a formula. The fact that Alaska and Hawaii, acceded to the Union through the constitutional process
yeah.
is somewhat more legitimizing than, creating new institutions like the European Union and trying to create an entirely new framework. But, there is actually a strain of British conservatism. And in fact, it's something you find among some of the British high Tories, some of the people who are attitudinally, at least, the sort of bluest bloods in the Conservative Party in the UK, who were pro-European Union. And it was, well, again, they saw it as just being a very large kind of federal system and not necessarily something that would be intruding upon whatever sovereignty needed to be preserved. So even there, you can find some diversity among conservative views.
The European Union is pretty Rousseauian, don't we think? Yeah, right. I mean, it makes sense that you would, okay. But I don't quite, I'm still not totally sure about your opposition to secession in the States here. Can you go over that again? I'm still not sure about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that there is, well, okay. My own opposition to secession, and this is not necessarily about conservatism per se, but I think in terms of, strategic logic, in terms of economic logic, the larger unit makes a lot more sense than something that is fragmented. And you see that around, much of the world. I mean, that's part of the impulse behind the European Union, although the European Union is just this kind of managerial bureaucracy as opposed to something that has real strategic cohesion or even economic cohesion.
Okay.
So those are practical realist concerns as opposed to purely conservative concerns.
Okay.
So to the extent that conservatism is, related to the idea of realism, I think there's a continuity there. Beyond that, in terms of people's affections and loyalties and so forth, the U.S., generally, and in fact, when we have tried to gobble up things that are, had a high degree of independence outside of us, like the former possessions of the Spanish Empire after the Spanish-American War, we've really done a botched job of it, right? So I mean, you get things like Puerto Rico, where it's not a state, it's not independent, it's a territory, and there are actually economic advantages and other things that are nice about being a territory, but it's in kind of a limbo, and it's kind of, constitutionally speaking, there's a certain unsatisfactory quality to that,
right.
Which is not the worst thing in the world necessarily, but it's if you were doing this at a philosophical level, you might say, hey, this should really be resolved in one direction or the other. But otherwise, even when you had things like the second Vermont Republic, or the first Vermont Republic, not the second. The second is an aspirational one. But the Vermont, independent republic, which was short-lived. When you had, Texas as its own republic, those things, they could have gone their own way. They could have been, sort of viable entities on their own and, developed separate traditions from the United States. But they wound up, joining in the Union fairly quickly and becoming, quite thoroughly assimilated into the Union. So I don't really see that people would have greater affection for these localities than they would have for the Union as a whole.
Okay. I thought you were going to say, maybe you did just say this, that Americans generally, except for in Carlos's great state, identify as Americans first and not by their state.
I think that's true. And even in Texas, Texas is an interesting case where, maybe it's 50-50. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or, and not 50-50 just in terms of
if
you surveyed the public, but in terms of people's individual minds. But I think part of being Texan is being American as well. I mean, there I think it's, even though the Texan identity is very strong, it's something which is seen as being complementary with rather than opposed to being American.
Right. So
but if Texas just marched into the Union, can it just march out?
Well, they have, when they joined, they had some constitutional reservations, right? Where they said, hey, maybe we'll call this off at some point. And, my secessionist friends often say, this could legally be something that you attempt and, you try to invoke these clauses, which, would probably not work very well. But, my friend Frank Buckley did this book just recently. It's about secession, may even be called American Secession. And his argument in part is that when you have these secessionist movements, one of the things that will happen, even if you don't get to the point of real secession, you'll get to a rebalancing of the center and the periphery and a decentralization of power, and that'll work out like Frank's own native Canada. So who knows, but I'm a little skeptical.
I don't know. I'm just depressed that we don't have you on our side in the coming secessionist civil wars, Daniel. Now that it's getting really spicy, I'm going to go to the private session. So if you're watching on YouTube and you want to join the RU sessions in the future, go to renegadeuniversity.com and become a member at any level. Now we're going to go private.